Senator Ted Cruz. He's the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit Hong Kong since pro-democracy protests began 4 months ago. We asked him about the president's saying that the situation in Hong Kong was dying down.
I'll tell you what's happening here in Hong Kong is inspiring. We've seen over 2 million people come to the streets standing up for freedom, standing up for democracy, and standing up against the oppression of the Chinese communist regime. And I think it is very much in the United States' interest to support the people of Hong Kong. I'm here, I'm dressed in all black, standing in solidarity with the protesters.
So the protests are not dying out, as the president suggested?
The protests are continuing full force, and I'll tell you something that really illustrates just how powerful the protests are, is what we've seen happen with the NBA this past week. Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Rockets, my hometown team, I'm a diehard Houston Rockets fan, but he tweeted a very benign tweet where he said, "Stand for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the Chinese Communist government, they just about lost it. They got so upset. They ended up boycotting the Rockets. They ended up pulling them off TV in China. They ended up pulling them off the internet. They ended up canceling all of their sponsorships. And sadly, what ended up happening is the NBA as a league began this series of apologies. And it was really sad to see an American company and indeed a global sports league like the NBA being dragooned into censoring the free speech of American citizens in the interest of big bucks. It's not complicated why the NBA did that. Television and the Chinese market is worth a whole lot of money, but thankfully a whole lot of us across the ideological spectrum, indeed I helped lead a group, a bipartisan group of members of Congress calling on the NBA to do better to defend free speech. And,
right.
and I'm proud to say I think the NBA is doing a better job of defending those free speech rights.
But isn't it really the U.S. government that should be leading the charge on this rather than free enterprise?
Well, but listen, American businesses shouldn't be in the business of censoring Americans. And we've seen this pattern, whether it's the NBA afraid of losing a bunch of money in China, or whether it's Hollywood censoring out any content that is critical of the communist government in China. You know, it's really an unfortunate dynamic how China uses its vast resources to promote censorship. And all of our allies are facing this increased aggressiveness of China, and we need to stand up. We need to defend our shared values.
Exactly. So should those kind of protections be in any kind of trade deal with China?
Well, listen, a trade deal is functionally different. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee just unanimously passed legislation on Hong Kong to pressure China to protect the free speech and democratic rights of the people of Hong Kong. That I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation,
right.
And it was bipartisan. We saw Republicans and Democrats come together.
Well, you're talking about legislation there, but what actions we've seen the Trump administration take about Muslim minorities who are being put in internment camps in China have been by the State Department pretty limited. The Commerce Department blacklisted some companies. How do you stop the Trump administration from using that as a bargaining chip in a trade deal?
I introduced legislation called the Tiananmen Act that would direct blacklisting the technology companies, the Chinese technology companies that China is using to engage in surveillance, to engage in repression and imprisonment and in torture and murder of up to 1 million Uyghurs, a religious minority. And as you noted, just this week, the Trump administration announced that they were implementing what is the core of my legislation, which is blacklisting those Chinese technology companies that are being used to suppress religious minorities. I think that's a really good step. It's a positive step by the administration.
Have they assured you that won't be in any way considered as a bargaining chip in negotiations?
Well, listen, I think we can do both. It's important to get a trade deal with China. I hope we do get a trade deal with China. We have enormous economic concerns, but we can do that and at the same time defend our core values.
China's a surveillance state. Is it appropriate for President Trump to be saying China should look into the Biden family? Is that appropriate?
Look, of course not. Elections in the U.S. should be decided by Americans, and it's not the business of foreign countries, any foreign countries, to be interfering in our elections.
Even Ukraine? I mean, when you're talking about some of this, I mean, do you think that, say, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who's been talking about China, who's been talking about Ukraine, do you want to hear him testify about this sort of shadow foreign policy?
Listen, foreign countries should stay out of American elections. That's true for Russia. That's true for Ukraine. That's true for China. That's true for all of them. It should be the American people deciding elections. I don't know what Rudy's been saying. I do know, though, that we should decide our elections. It should be the American people making those decisions.
And you do want him to testify before your committee?
I think it'd make a lot of sense for Rudy to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. That's ultimately a question for the committee chairman, Lindsey Graham, but I'd like to see Rudy testify, yes.
So the president is often talking about the need to look into Joe Biden. If he is so concerned, would it be in any way appropriate for him to bring it to his own Justice Department instead of talking about foreign countries looking into his political rival?
I have long advocated that the Justice Department should enforce the law, should investigate corruption, should investigate violations of law, regardless of party.
But to be clear, you're not calling for the Justice Department to investigate the Biden family.
Look, I believe the Justice Department should investigate violations of law. If there's credible evidence of a violation of law, yes, they should investigate it. And I'll tell you what I have called for. I think President Trump wisely released the transcript of his conversation with the Ukrainian government. I think that was good because a lot of what the Democrats had been raising, alleging an illegal quid pro quo, was not in fact backed up by the transcript. But I think actually the administration should do the exact same thing for Joe Biden, that it should release the transcripts of Joe Biden's conversations with Ukraine, use the same standard for President Trump and Joe Biden, and let the American people read the transcripts and decide.
Senator Cruz, we will leave it there. Thank you for joining us from Hong Kong.